Hi, welcome to the presentation today. What I'm doing is recording a version of the presentation I did on November 2nd and 3rd, 2017 to the U.S. Special Operations Command workshop that was working on identifying biomarkers in warfare, overtraining, injury, and recovery. This presentation took place at the Florida Institute of Human and Machine Cognition in Pensacola, Florida. The objective of the presentation was to present a model for long-term athlete development. We're going to identify processes and technologies for tracking athletes. We're going to present a model for why you will have maladaption, athlete maladaption in your program. And we're going to take a look at a model for identifying key performance indicators that you can use in your programming. One of the things I like to emphasize is that while we can't guarantee wins and losses, we can increase probabilities of success while decreasing probabilities of failure. And this can be done on both individual and team basis. And an important part of this is before you can get the right answers, you have to ask the right questions. And while I stumbled into this, I wanted to make sure and pass it along because it's been a pretty valuable learning opportunity for me. The program started back in 2015. At the time, I had my own facility and lab that I was operating. I'm a former Ohio State wrestler and had a good relationship with the head coach. And the Ohio State wrestling team in 2014 and 15, the wrestler there on the left is a guy by the name of Logan Stieber. And Logan had won 3 national titles up until this point and was coming back as a senior to win his 4th national title. There's only ever been 4 athletes actually achieve that goal. The other 3 athletes there on the right were freshmen. The first one is Kyle Snyder. Kyle went on to win 3 national titles, an Olympic gold medal, multiple world championships. Nate Tomasello was in the middle, was a 4-time All-American, and Bo Jordan was also a 4-time All-American. And those 3 guys were freshmen on that team. So Ohio State knew they had a lot of points going into the national tournament, but just needed a little bit of insurance because they'd never won a national title in the past, and this is what the goal was. So the story that we're going to start off is about this guy. His name's Kenny Courts. Kenny was a 184-pounder, and Kenny was a very talented wrestler, a 3-time Pennsylvania state champion. But at Ohio State, he was just struggling. He was in the starting lineup, but he was not doing what we knew he could do. And the coach brought him to me for an assessment. They had run him through all the programs at OSU. He came out of all those normal, but coach knew something was off. So when he brought him, I wired him up with what I call a Zephyr BioHarness. This is a heart rate monitor that also measures respiration. It has a 3-dimensional accelerometer in it that we can use for other movement-based assessment. We weren't using it for that day. I was using it primarily as a heart rate monitor and a respiration tool. Prior to Kenny getting on the bike for the test, though, I always look at heart rate variability prior to testing. And so we're measuring on a Sunday morning, a solid 48 hours after a contest, and we should expect a pretty high HRV at that time. One of the things that jumped out at me was Kenny's HRV that morning was about 10 milliseconds, which is pretty much a full stress indicator. I had him go lay down for about 5 minutes. The HRV climbed up to 100 milliseconds, and as soon as he stood up, it crashed back down to 10 milliseconds. So that was one of my first indications that we've got something that we have to deal with here regarding training. Then we put him on a bike ergometer, and we did just a standard graded exercise stress test. At the top of the graph, you'll see the wattages. The thick line is his heart rate. The thin line is respiration. Respiration kind of fell apart late in the test. But the big thing is you see at about 210 watts, you see his heart rate really start to take off. And what we have found is that, truth be told, that power threshold, he should have been able to sustain about at least 30% more than that. That an elite wrestler should be able to do 270, 280 watts at threshold. As you can see, he was peaking at 230, should have peaked at about 300. So we have two big indications with this athlete. That number one, unusually high HRV at rest. When we laid him down, we see it climb, drop back down to 10 milliseconds. So just the process of standing up was causing a full stress response. And he's coming off the bike erg about half of the wattage that he should have, a half to 3/4. So normally in the past, we would have called this overtraining syndrome. When I talked to the coach, what I told him is, I said, what's happening is that this athlete is maladapting to his training. I don't like using the term overtraining because of the way it is taken by coaches many times. So what we decided to do was I was given some control over this athlete. And what we did was we started an Omega Wave unit. We started measuring morning and pre-practice HRVs. Between February 19th and February 28th, we were basically just using training caps in practice. Is that I would not let his heart rate exceed a certain level in practice, which really meant that we couldn't train. He basically just drilled. There was very little live wrestling during this time. And from a culture standpoint, this was a real shock to the system, because this was a coaching staff that prides themselves on working hard. Out there on the 30th, we had that great response on the 28th. I let him go full go on the 29th. The 30th, we see the drop. And then we also saw a weight cut coming into play here around March 5th. But the important part was we were able to put him into the Big Ten tournament at a little over 50 milliseconds. He qualified for the national tournament, and which was the big goal. He finished 8th in the Big Ten. We qualified for the national tournament. So I had to unleash him just a little bit on the maximum wrestling levels and wrestling live. But I was hypothesizing at the time that there was something holding him back. There was a reason why his central nervous system wasn't letting him recover. And my hypothesis is that he had done so much anaerobic training that we needed to tell his aerobic system or trigger that aerobic system into saying, you know what, I've got the base that I need. So the way we did that is I put him back on that same bike ergometer. And the bike I'm able to program, and we knew his threshold wattage was 140 watts. And that's where we got response. So this was the first day that we were on the bike ergometer after Big Tens. The next day, you see a dramatic shift in what the average heart rate was at the same wattage. So the workloads are exactly the same in all four of the rides I'm getting ready to show you. We saw a nice little adjustment on the third day. And then finally on the fourth day, we really saw that shift down in the workload, in the heart rate response to the given workload. And this was a big deal because when we take a look at that, we also saw a peak in the RMSSD and the heart rate variability, which I was really excited about. He had a pretty hard workout that day going live. But what you see is that we were able to sustain RMSSDs, we were able to sustain HRVs that were well over 50 milliseconds. That 50 that you see there was with a weight cut. But the point was that Kenny was able to go into the national tournament that year. He made All-American, and I finished, I think, 5th in the country. And the Ohio State won a national title. So this is what led into us really developing our program at Ohio State. So as we move through this, when I think of stress, I think of a workout as a box of stress. And that box, the height of the box is the intensity, the width of the box is the duration of the workout, and then in the box we add a mode or whatever we're doing that day. We then design boxes of stress throughout the week, throughout the cycle, and we apply this to the athlete. And so in this graphic, the straight line represents homeostasis. and the red box represents a box of stress. And when we add stress to the athlete, they don't get stronger, they actually get weaker. But with recovery, we get super compensation, we get stronger than our previous self, we add another box of stress, and we repeat the process. And this is the way training's supposed to work. Now, part of our challenge is that sometimes if we don't have good recovery, if recovery is blocked for some reason, we actually see a decline in the athlete readiness and a decline in the athlete level, so that we eventually work towards injury. And this is one of the challenges that we have as a coach, is preventing injury and having athletes that are ready for competition. So again, heart rate variability, if you haven't seen it, we're measuring the difference in time between heartbeats. This changes based on the central nervous system's autonomic status, whether it's sympathetic or parasympathetic. Now, the different things that lead to changes. So one of the challenges that we have is that we have a lot of different athletes that we work with. We have a lot of genetics, and when we look at this continuum, on one end of the continuum, we have athletes like Usain Bolt, who is a very dominant type 2 fast twitch muscle fiber athlete. And then on the other end of the continuum, we have athletes like Wilson Kipsang, who is a very dominant type 1 slow twitch athlete. But you know what, as a coach, either guy can show up for practice. We don't do genetic selection, but there's going to be a difference in how those athletes respond to your training program. And then, I like to think about this graphic, that the middle of these are athletes that probably excel in court sports like basketball and team handball. This second quintile next to Kipsang, I like to think of this as field sports. In the fourth quintile, the one next to Bolt, these are still pretty anaerobic athletes. I think wrestling falls in here. Hockey falls up here a little bit, but there are different sport demands. But there's a challenge in the genetics of the athletes that walk in to train with us. And if you've heard me give this presentation, you know that I talk about Ohio State had a wrestler in 2011 that was able to. He achieved All-American status that year, but in 2010 he ran the Columbus Marathon in 3 hours and 7 minutes. So a 3 hour and 7 minute marathoner is a very type 1 fiber type athlete, and this guy happens to be in the sport of wrestling, which is a very type 2 anaerobic sport. So a lot of times there's mismatches, and our challenge is figuring out what is the right training for the athlete. Well, as coaches, we have this challenge that not only do we have the genetic fiber type differences, we have athletes showing up with different somatic or motor level development. That's the diagonal continuum here. We have athletes come in with different bioenergetic training levels. And then finally, we have athletes show up with different recovery abilities, both sympathetic and parasympathetic. So it can be a real challenge sometimes creating the program that fits all the athletes that may come through your door. So in dealing with this, one of the challenges that we have is getting athletes to make good decisions. We want good behaviors. Good behaviors lead to culture. Good culture lead to better decisions, and this feeds it. So as a team or as a program, how do you modify this circle? Well, I think you have to use data and knowledge injected at the decision level to help modify behaviors, which will then become better culture, which will then be reinforced with the information that comes through. So this is how I approach this from a team standpoint. So in 2015-16, this was the second year of our program. One of my alumnus, who was a teammate of mine, who is a pain management doc, Dr. Ron Garbo, gave us a first beat system, which included bodyguards, which this gives me the ability to measure HRV over 24, 48, 72 hour periods. which was very informative for us. So when we took a look at our 216 nighttime RMSSD measures, we found something really interesting, that this 129 over here, this was from my Olympic gold medalist. The 110 was from an Olympic medalist, not a gold medalist. My 98 was from a national champion. The 92 was from an athlete that finished third in the country. I put this 95 in here. This was from a CrossFit age group world champion. And then as we move down, this 15 milliseconds, we talked about this. This is an athlete that's struggling to recover. This 45 was interesting. This was from an athlete that the year we did this measurement, he did not achieve All-American status. In 2017, when he came back, though, and we did the measurement going into the national tournament was 75 milliseconds, and he was able to achieve All-American status. So what we have found is that there's actually a relationship between athlete readiness and their ability to achieve All-American status. Now, where does this come from? So one of the things, again, in the behavior continuum, it's really difficult to get good readiness without good sleep. So sleep is something we talk to our athletes a lot about. And sleep is something more than just getting in bed. It's about having an environment that promotes recovery. So this is a 24-hour measurement from an individual that got good nighttime sleep. And red is obviously sympathetic, green is parasympathetic, and that's what you're looking at there. We have a lot of good green parasympathetic behavior at sleep. Now, again, one of our challenges with college athletes is discussing the role of alcohol. This is a 24-hour measure where someone consumed 4 beers before they went to bed. And what you see is that we're seeing a very strong sympathetic contribution. There's just not a lot of restfulness. So what we found is that, if you drink 4 beers before you go to bed, you're essentially cutting the value of your sleep in half. So, this, and using data and knowledge is one of the things that we use to help build culture and move through this. So in 2016 and 17, we moved the program on even more, and we started to look at what we call key performance indicators. In that season, we collected about 500,000 data points, which across the board, and we're going to spend some time looking at that. And when we look at our program, we look at 4 big physiological areas: the body comp of the athlete, the cardiovascular fitness, the athlete's strength, and the athlete's readiness or resiliency. So the tools that we use to look at all these things, we look at body comp with DEXA scans. We also do skin fold measurements more readily. We do a DEXA scan twice a year. We do skin folds on some people weekly when they're in the right phase, and we weigh them in daily. Which got us a lot of good information. From a cardiovascular and strength standpoint, we estimated VO2 using 3K times. We did strength measurements that included a weighted weight hold. We looked at grip strength on both right and left. We did planks for muscular endurance. We did pull-ups for muscle endurance. We measured bench press. We measured bench press as a percent of body weight. We did deadlifts and deadlifts as a percent of body weight. We also looked at vertical jump. And then finally, we measured readiness using heart rate variability. So, and then we broke the group into 4 levels. The group number 1 is someone who has achieved at least All-American status. And I think there was 9 athletes in that group from our team of about 35. And we also had a group that we called 2s. And these are athletes that we believe would have been All-American, but for some reason they were redshirting, or it didn't make sense to put them into another group, so we combined them. Group number 3 is a group of athletes that had made our starting lineup but were never able to achieve All-American status. And then finally, group number 4 were athletes that had never started for us. Now, mind you, this is a pretty high caliber team. that group 4 has multiple time state champions. They have some very excellent athletes in that group, but for some reason they just weren't able to move up the continuum that we had. So we took all those assessments that we did and we looked at the groups. So we looked at 1s versus 2, 3s, and 4s, 1s and 2s, and 1s and 2s versus 3s and 4s. And one of the important things that we found here is that a lot of people consider wrestling to be an anaerobic sport. But when we looked at 3K times, what we found is that 3K times had a statistically significant effect in predicting success at all levels between our 1s and 2s, our 3s, and our 4s. So when we take a look at this, cardiovascular fitness wrestling is actually a cardiovascular sport. And I think it's important to note that all energy production is eventually cardiovascular. And it's beyond the scope of this presentation about how that works, but I'll record my thoughts on that at some point in time. We also looked at, again, culture is a big deal, and what you emphasize in your culture is important. So if you go down to the bottom of this presentation, what you see here is that we're looking at the traditional exercises of bench press and bench press as a percent of body weight, deadlift, and so forth. And what you see is that from a strength standpoint is that absolute strength, is only a statistically significant predictor of moving from groups 3 and 4 into groups 1 and 2. This is a really important point. So once you achieve a certain strength level, strong enough is an important point and something that needs to be emphasized. And what you see is that from a bench press standpoint, that there is, by the way, the numbers in the cells are p-values. So only a p-value of less than 0.1 was considered statistically significant. You see the p-values on the bench press are pretty high. But what we did see is that muscular endurance, when we looked at planks, when we looked at pull-ups, that muscular endurance was a very important predictor of an athlete's ability to move between groups. So again, trying to figure out what our culture is, trying to establish using culture and good data to lead to good decisions, that was the objective of the program. Vertical jump down here was interesting. So when we did vertical jump in the fall, when the athletes returned to campus, we had a 0.22 correlation there. But when we measured vertical jump the week after the national tournament, we saw the real significance come into play. So this has to do with kind of I think from a coaching standpoint, paying attention to your periodization program and what you're looking for the athletes at the right time is an important part of your program development. So one of the key elements that we got out of this season was that we also took the HRV scores, and within the HRV scores, you can break out whether something is sympathetic or parasympathetic. So the valgus score, this is usually an RMSSD score. It can also be a high-frequency score. What we found is that there was a definitive line between an athlete's score and whether they are able to win or lose a given match. So we went back and looked at all the HRV data against their matches. Did they win? Did they lose? And what the scores were. And not only do you see the parasympathetic contributing, we also see the sympathetic as having a clearly distinct line as to an athlete's ability to win or lose. We take this one more step and we looked at that parasympathetic score, and then we looked at point differentials in the match. And what you see is that as parasympathetic quality improves, athletes scored more points in a match. As the parasympathetic process declined, athletes scored less points. So if you spend some more time looking at this particular characteristic, what you're going to find is that this athlete's central nervous system status, readiness, And this was for an elite team. We had selection on this team coming in, so someone who didn't have a high enough skill set never made it into the room. So all of a sudden, we normalized on skill to a certain degree. But when we take a look at the key elements of when we want to build culture, what are the right questions to ask, this gave us a really good tool for moving through our program and development for the future. We then took the same program, and we don't have the data in this presentation, but we started doing in-practice heart rate measurement. And the 2018 season, we were able to collect about 3.5 million data points from about 35 athletes, and we didn't see anything that really deviated from what we had in this data set. Didn't see a need to really add it on to the presentation at this time. So if you have questions or if there's information that you're looking for, feel free to reach out to me on trainrecoverwin.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn, Don Moxley on LinkedIn. And thanks for taking the time to watch the presentation.